Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into a really intense topic pulled directly from the stack of material you've given us. We're looking at that complex, often volatile space where protests meet policing, with a specific focus on recent events right here in California.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot here.
The sources you've shared cover a lot of ground. Detailed accounts of recent events in Los Angeles, analysis of a specific California law designed to protect journalists covering these situations.
Right, that's Penal Code 409.7.
Exactly. And even a deep dive into the documented effects of certain crowd control tools, like kinetic impact projectiles, often called rubber bullets.
So our mission in this deep dive is really to help you cut through the noise, extract the most important insights from all this material. We'll unpack the context of these recent events, examine those legal protections intended for the press.
See how they actually worked or didn't.
Precisely. And understand the documented impacts of certain police munitions based on the research you've provided, and just sort of see how these different threads connect.
Okay, let's unpack this then. So the material we're working with kicks off by setting the scene in Los Angeles County, detailing events that began around June 6th, 2025.
Yeah, and what the sources describe as the trigger for this unrest. Well, it started with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. They were conducting raids targeting illegal immigrants in several locations across the city.
Okay. And the reports show that these initial protests against those raids, they escalated pretty quickly into street riots. There were significant clashes between protesters and law enforcement, first involving the LAPD and ICE.
And then, according to the sources, federal forces reportedly became involved as well.
Okay.
That's right. The material indicates that, dozens of demonstrators were arrested during this period. And sadly, multiple law enforcement officers were injured. Sources mentioned 2 LAPD officers hurt when motorcyclists reportedly tried to breach a police line.
Wow.
And protesters were injured too. The source noted at least 3 reported injuries on that side.
Right. And here's where the situation took a really significant turn, according to these reports you shared. On June 7th, President Trump reportedly federalized 300 members of the California National Guard. The sources point out he used a specific section of the U.S. Code, 10 U.S.C., Section 12406. Now, the material highlights this is apparently a power rarely used without a state governor's approval.
Yeah, that's a key point the sources make. And they also give us insight into the administration's stance through some, very strong statements. For instance, Board Czar Tom Homan is quoted warning that someone's going to lose their life if the protest didn't stop.
Oof.
And even suggested the California governor and LA mayor could face federal charges over how they handled the situation. Another figure, Stephen Miller, is quoted in the material stating, "Deport the invaders or surrender to insurrection."
Strong words.
Very. And adding that if the protest continued, the United States would, quote, cease to exist.
Okay, so bringing it back to the local response documented in the sources, the LAPD declared a tactical alert, which, that's a key step. Usually means police are prepping for heightened activity, potential conflict.
Right. Standard procedure in these situations.
And they also authorized the use of less lethal munitions to disperse protesters, declared an unlawful assembly, which is, the legal thing they have to say, to order dispersal and start arrests.
Yeah, that declaration is crucial legally.
And stated that anyone throwing objects would be arrested.
It's important to note, though, as the sources do, that there were also counter-perspectives documented. Senator Bernie Sanders, for example, is reported denouncing the Trump administration's actions, calling them a move towards authoritarianism.
Okay.
The material also notes support for the protesters from groups like the Party for Socialism and Liberation and the Democratic Socialists of America. And we see the California governor reportedly asked President Trump to return control of those federalized National Guard forces back to the state.
So it's this whole mix. Escalating tension, arrests, injuries on multiple sides. And the sources point out that amidst all this, one specific group faced particular challenges, journalists trying to cover it all.
Exactly. And this leads us directly into the next big area covered in your source material. Those legal protections that exist specifically for journalists covering protests in California.
Penal Code 409.7.
That's the one. And, how those protections actually held up in practice during these events and others.
So the sources specifically discussed this California Penal Code Section 409.7. Tell us about that.
Well, the background provided shows this law was reportedly a direct response to what journalists went through during the Black Lives Matter protests back in 2020. Many reporters were arrested, shoved, even injured by munitions just trying to do their jobs.
Right.
Before this law, California statutes let reporters cross police lines during, like, disasters, fires, earthquakes, that sort of thing.
Okay.
But it didn't explicitly cover public protests declared unlawful assemblies. And that legal gap meant reporters were sometimes getting arrested for failure to disperse just for staying put to film a report.
Okay. So Section 409.7 was created to fix that loophole. What the sources detail is that this law says, basically, at a protest where police set up a line or close an area, a duly authorized representative of any news service, that's the official term, may enter the closed areas.
And this is the crucial part.
Yeah, it explicitly prohibits police from arresting reporters for failure to disperse, violating a curfew, or just filming police in a public place.
Which is a First Amendment right anyway, but the law reinforces it in this context. Now, the material does add a necessary clarification. This law doesn't give journalists, a free pass if they're doing something else that's already illegal.
Sure, it's not a shield for everything.
Exactly. It's narrowly focused on their reporting function. And it also reportedly gives an arrested reporter the right to contact a supervisor to challenge the detention, unless, circumstances make that impossible.
So the intent seems pretty clear: protect journalists covering protests. But the sources indicate the reality hasn't always lined up with the intent. One source is pretty blunt, just saying police hate it when they are filmed doing their jobs.
Yeah, and the sources give examples that kind of illustrate this disconnect. While journalists have sometimes successfully used 409.7 to get through lines,
Okay.
the material describes a law being violated right and left during some recent campus protests. One specific case highlighted is the arrest of journalist Sean Beckner Carmichael at UCLA while he was filming police actions.
I remember reading about that in the sources.
Yeah, the source explicitly says his arrest violated 409.7, his First Amendment right to film, and his Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable seizure. Now, citing the law apparently helped get him released later that day.
Okay, so it did help eventually.
Eventually. But the source emphasizes he shouldn't have been arrested in the first place. And the sources also point out, importantly, that student journalists and faculty reporting on their own campuses are also specifically protected by 409.7.
Good to know. And tying this back to the LA events in June 2025 that we started with, the reports you provided confirm that despite these protections, 2 journalists were injured by the LAPD during that unrest.
Which brings us to the tools themselves.
Right. The topic of journalist injuries often brings up the tools sometimes used in crowd control, commonly called rubber bullets. Your source material includes something really important here: a systematic research review on the health consequences of these weapons, formerly known as kinetic impact projectiles, or KIPs.
Yeah, KIPs, when used in crowd control situations.
Exactly.
And this review is significant because it crunched data from 1990 all the way to 2017, looking specifically at injuries caused by KIPs in these settings. And the findings documented in this research are, well, they're quite sobering. Out of nearly 2,000 people injured by KIPs in the studies they reviewed, 53 people died.
Wow.
As a direct result of their injuries. That's 3% of those injured.
3%. And the long-term impact.
Also striking. The research shows 300 people suffered permanent disability from KIP injuries. That's over 15% of those injured.
15% permanently disabled. That's huge.
It is. And the sources highlight the severity, too. 71% of injuries in those who survived were classified as severe. Now, while the most frequent injuries were, bruises, broken bones in arms and legs, skin lacerations, the most devastating outcomes of those deaths and permanent disabilities were overwhelmingly caused by hits to the head and neck.
Yeah, the statistics on that are grim. The sources report nearly half the deaths, 49.1%, and the vast majority of permanent disabilities, 82.6%, resulted from KIP strikes specifically to the head and neck.
Think about that. Head and neck shots.
And injuries like blindness, ranging from legal blindness to total loss of vision, were a major cause of that permanent disability.
The research also explains a bit about why these weapons can be so dangerous. KIPs work by, transferring kinetic energy. Blunt force trauma, basically. And while many are designed with a large surface area to, lose speed quickly and hopefully reduce penetration at longer distances.
Right, that's the idea.
That same design feature can also make their flight paths really unpredictable. It reduces accuracy. And the sources note, some KIPs even have muzzle velocity similar to live ammunition.
Seriously?
Yeah. So ultimately, the severity of the injury is highly dependent on the firing distance. Closer is generally worse, and critically, the specific body part that gets hit. The material also suggests that maybe rubber-coated metal bullets, or those with metal components, might be even more lethal than the ones made just of plastic or rubber.
Okay. So based on all this data, the conclusion of this big systematic review is pretty stark.
It really is. It concludes that KIPs do not appear to be appropriate weapons for use in crowd control settings. The study explicitly cites their inherent inaccuracy, the potential for misuse like firing too close or aiming at the head, and the documented risk of severe injury, disability, and death.
And the sources put this in a broader context too, right? Like international standards.
Yeah, they mention international principles that guide the use of force, calling for necessity and proportionality. Force should only be used when necessary, and only as much as needed. And while some U.S. police guidelines exist, they don't mandate the use of crowd control weapons. It's an option, not a requirement. The study notes that KIPs are often recommended for specific situations, like arresting violent individuals or dispersing really dangerous riots.
Okay.
But the research suggests these intended uses don't really align well with the KIP's documented limitations, especially their inaccuracy and the danger at close range.
Which is often where these confrontations happen.
Exactly.
So unfortunately, the serious risks of KIPs documented in that research, they line up disturbingly with real-world incidents involving journalists covering protests. Your sources detail some notable injuries from the 2020 George Floyd protests.
Yeah, these examples really bring the data to life, unfortunately.
We see the case of journalist Linda Tirado. The reports state she was permanently blinded in one eye in Minneapolis, shot by a projectile. She later received a $600,000 settlement. And the sources note she was clearly identifiable as press badge, camera, and was reportedly separate from the main group of protesters when she was hit.
Right. Another case mentioned is journalist Jared Goyette, struck in the nose by a projectile, also in Minneapolis. He was part of a shared settlement totaling $825,000. And again, the material indicates he too was separated from protesters, even on his phone when he was injured.
And photographer Trevor Hughes in Denver, shot in the hand, broken finger, destroyed camera. He got a total settlement of $485,000. The sources say he believed he was specifically targeted while he was documenting police actions.
And a common thread in these cases, based on the sources, is the journalists claiming they were targeted or subjected to excessive force while clearly identifying themselves as press.
Which goes back to that tension we talked about, maybe related to being filmed.
Could be. The sources also mention the legal hurdles, like qualified immunity, which often protects government officials unless their actions clearly violate established law. It makes these lawsuits really hard to win, even with significant injuries.
So bringing it right back to the present, or near present, June 2025 in Los Angeles. Your sources confirm 2 journalists were, in fact, injured by the LAPD during the unrest there.
Yeah, despite the existence of Penal Code 409.7.
The reports identify them as Australian reporter Lauren Tomasi and British photographer Nick Stern, and the details from the sources are specific. Lauren Tomasi was reportedly shot in the ankle by a rubber bullet while she was live on camera.
Live camera.
Yeah. And Nick Stern was hit in the thigh by what's described as a high-velocity sponge bullet, serious enough it required surgery.
Ouch. And the sources highlight different accounts of what happened, right? They quote Nick Stern describing what he saw as indiscriminate targeting of everybody who's at the protests, though he did acknowledge some people were throwing things.
Okay, so his perspective was indiscriminate.
But regarding Lauren Tomasi's injury, while an initial news report described her as being caught in the crossfire, reactions cited in one source suggest maybe the officer deliberately aimed at her. One report apparently claimed you can see the officer turn and target her while she had her back turned, reporting.
So conflicting accounts there, but journalists injured nonetheless.
Definitely.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together then, what does this deep dive into the sources really reveal? We've seen the complex, often volatile reality on the ground during recent protests in LA, starting with immigration enforcement, escalating fast, injuries, arrests on multiple sides.
Right, and the response from both federal and local authorities involving significant force and, some really strong rhetoric, as we saw in those quotes.
Yeah. Then we examined the specific legal protections designed for the press in California, that's Section 409.7, recognizing, based on the material, that while the law aims to prevent arrests just for reporting, its effectiveness in these really volatile situations can be inconsistent. Sometimes it's reportedly just violated.
And we've looked hard at the documented serious risks associated with using tools like kinetic impact projectiles in crowd control, drawing from that big research review that shows a really concerning potential for severe injury, disability, and even death.
And woven all through this picture is the experience of the journalists themselves. trying to document these public events, acting as the eyes and ears for all of us, really, sometimes reportedly targeted or injured while just doing their essential role, leading to significant personal cost, physically, financially, as we saw in those settlement cases and the recent LA injuries.
Yeah, it all highlights this ongoing tension that runs through the sources. The tension between the need to maintain public order, enforce laws, and the fundamental rights of both public assembly and a free press, especially when things get volatile and force is used.
So we've covered the recent LA events, the details of California's press freedom law and how it's playing out, the frankly concerning data on injuries from crowd control projectiles.
From that systematic review, yeah.
And documented instances of journalists getting hurt doing their jobs, both in 2020 and just recently in 2025, according to these reports.
So maybe a final thought for you to consider based on all this. Given what the sources reveal about the documented dangers of using KIPs.
Yeah, those numbers stick with you.
Right. And given the legal protections that are intended to shield the press, and the accounts of journalists still sustaining serious injuries while reporting on public events, consider this. What is the broader societal impact, the cost, when the very act of documenting public events becomes an inherently risky activity for the people whose specific job it is to inform the public? What does that risk mean for our collective ability to witness and understand what's actually happening during times of civil unrest?
That's a really important question to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the sources. We hope this gives you a clearer picture of this complex and critical issue.